I think there isn't enough attention to the systemic ways in which Black women are subjected to both state violence and intimate violence. So, the way in which intimate violence is treated in the United States doesn't really take account of the deeply embedded racism and sexism, homophobia, classism that Black women have to face that's connected to why many are survivors of violence. There are studies showing, for example, that the kinds of law enforcement practices that have been relied on to address intimate violence in Black women's lives have actually increased the violence against them. We also know that very often the result of relying on the police and law enforcement mechanisms to address intimate violence leads to violence against Black women themselves. And because of stereotypes about Black women, that we're more aggressive, that we need less protection, that we're angry, we get less protection from the police and are also more likely to be beaten up by the police. And our partners are more likely to be killed by the police. And even some women have been killed by police responding to calls for help. So these law enforcement mechanisms haven't been effective, and they've even led to more violence. So I think our framework and our responses to intimate violence against women should change by relying less, if at all, on law enforcement mechanisms like mandatory arrest and incarcerating abusers and other kinds of state enforcement mechanisms that rely on punishment and violence against both the perpetrators and sometimes the victims of violence. So we have to imagine alternatives, which is hard because in our country, the instinct is so often to lock people up for everything. We're so reliant on prisons and aggressive state punishment to solve every problem that it's hard to even imagine an alternative. And so feminists of color like Incite, The Color of Violence, have been imagining other ways of addressing violence against women. One would be to demand from the government the resources that women need to be less vulnerable to violence, to be able to control their own lives and to get away from violent partners. So things like higher incomes, minimum wage for workers, adequate housing supports, adequate supports for taking care of children, childcare, universal health care, single payer, paid by the government and available to everybody. All of those things would reduce violence more than relying on locking people up. So one way of addressing this is to work toward the kinds of supports that women need. And then another is to address the culture of violence. Get to the bottom of it. Why is it that men in our society think that it's okay to use violence to control women, to exercise power over women? Why is that so accepted at so many levels in our society? How do we address that? That doesn't change by throwing people in prison. That changes through a kind of education process